Special Operations, Covert Ops, Espionage, The Team House, with your hosts, Jack Murphy and David Park.
All right, here we are. This is episode 82 of The Team House. God willing, the internet cooperates this time with us. If it doesn't, we're getting it fixed tomorrow, actually. So if it doesn't, I'm afraid I'll have to upload a recording of this episode. I hope that it cooperates tonight, but this should be the last time we ever have this issue. So without further ado, I'm Jack Murphy here with co-host Dave Park. Our guest tonight is Lino Miani. He is a combat diver, served with 1st Special Forces Group. He has experience all over the Asian area of responsibility, experience with NATO, experience working with foreign special operations units, also being deployed to North Africa. So there is really no shortage of things to talk about here tonight. I think this is going to be really exciting because we have a lot of people on the show, including Dave and I, lots of experience in the Middle East. Everyone was over there during the War on Terror, but you're going to hear some stories, I think, tonight from Lino that you've never heard before.
Yeah, and you're also part of a foundation, right? Do you want to tell us about that before we start?
Yeah. So first of all, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it. I've really enjoyed getting to know both of you a little bit before the show, and it's always good to talk story with SF dudes when I get the chance. I don't get to do that very often, so thanks. But yeah, I'm the president of the Combat Dyer Foundation. I think most people that know a little about me know that. And I wanted to start with this because you're getting an exclusive here on the Team House. We are announcing our summer event. It's a reunion event and a fundraiser we call the Deep Dive on this show. So on August 21st, Combat Diver Foundation and the Floribama Lounge are hosting the Deep Dive 21 at the Floribama Lounge in Perdido Key on the Alabama-Florida state lines. Biggest beach bar in Florida, owned by a combat diver buddy of mine, guy I knew from when we were in the infantry together. And it's going to be a good time. 5K run, a charity dive, some raffles, an auction, a lot of booze, and some combat divers talking stories. So it'll be a good time.
Yeah, that's awesome. And so what does the foundation support, and tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, the Combat Diver Foundation is dedicated to preserving the history of the combat diver community writ large. And we get a lot of questions about what that means because it started as an idea to preserve one specific artifact, and that was the class plaques that are on the walls down in the compound in Key West where we go to school. What we learned as we started researching and learning more about the history is that we really shouldn't limit ourselves to that one specific thing. There's so much combat diver history to be preserved. And so we've shied away from defining that term, combat diver, as someone who went to a specific school, because we'd be cutting out so many relevant people from the community that we just wanted to have a sort of large tent. So we've got members in 6 countries. We've got 35 states, people that are living in 35 states, 6 countries. And, we've got allied special forces. We've got folks from all the joint force, the joint special ops force, that are members of the combat diver community. And we're working to preserve their history. And that includes the SEALs and the CCTs and the soft TAC-P guys and the Marines and everybody.
Awesome. And is there a website where people can go to find more information about the foundation and the event itself?
Yeah. So if you go to combatdiver.org, that's singular, combatdiver.org, you'll be able to find everything you need to know there. And you can donate on the site. We've got some great merchandise. And pretty soon we'll be putting up the event page for Deep Dive 21.
Okay, great. Yeah. Yep. So everybody check it out. If you got a few bucks, please send it their way. Awesome. So Lino, one of the things we like to do, because Jack and I are both big comic book geeks, so one of the things we like to do at the beginning of the episode is to ask people for their origin story. How did you grow up? Did that influence your decision to go in the military? Things like that. We want to know who you are.
And well, it's one thing before. I just want to make sure that we've had some sound issues on the show the last 2 episodes. Like, so if Dave and I sound a lot lower than Lino, please let us know in the chat. Just tell me, and I'll crank up the volume on our end a little bit. Sorry about that. I'm just like super self-conscious about the technical issues we've been having. But yeah, Lino, please let us know where did you get your beginning? Where did you come out of?
Yeah, origin story, superhero thing. So I appreciate that. I was kind of laughing that you just described me as a combat diver. I am a combat diver, but good grief, I'm like a 5-jump chump in the combat diver world. And we try to, going back to the CDF a little bit, we try to professionalize that operation so that it's not just a good old boys club for combat divers. Mm-hmm. So, for example, a lot of our staff are not combat divers. They have some connection, but they aren't. But anyway, yeah. So my origin story, I was an Air Force brat. So my father was an NCO in the U.S. Air Force. He was a missile tech, tactical missiles, which has led to some cool stories down the road because my dad served in Vietnam and in Thailand. Later, after Vietnam, Da Nang was shut down. He moved over to Thailand and was part of the secret war over there. And I actually had the opportunity to take him back up to Udon Thani where he was based and kind of check out all his old haunts. And we discovered some cool stuff in the jungle that even the Thais didn't know, which, hopefully we'll get the chance to tell that story. But my mother was also in the Air Force, and that's where they met. So my dad had a little bit of experience, and when my mother was in their equivalent of AIT at Keesler Air Force Base, they met. And the story my mom likes to tell is that she's Puerto Rican, and she likes to say that she learned English in the Air Force, which I think is just a myth because, she had an accounting degree going into the Air Force, and it's like, she tells me her first word was shit. And so she got sick and went to sick call, and the DIs were like, "What's wrong with you?" And she's like, "Shit." Anyway, so they met, and, the rest is history. They got married, and here I am. So I grew up as an Air Force brat all over the world. And that experience sort of detribalizes a person a bit. So I come from a background where my mother's second language was English and is culturally sort of unique. I'm living in Europe. I'm spending summers in Puerto Rico. I'm moving all over the country. And it just, you just sort of look at stuff different when you're a kid. And so it wasn't an easy life. When you're a little kid, and you get uprooted every 3 years for a PCS move, and you're 12 years old, you don't even know that you have a funny accent, and you show up in a place like a new school in Boston and people tell you you're a redneck because you speak like you're from Ohio. It just that tends to shape the way you kind of view things. So for me, everything was the world is a unique and interesting place to be experienced and investigated. And not realizing that was really a deeply ingrained personality trait. When I joined the Army, I started seeking out things that were going to take me to interesting places. And so I joined the infantry, went to West Point, joined the infantry. From there, I wasn't satisfied with that. And I was like, well, I better go SF. So I went SF and there's a funny story about how I ended up at first group with Spanish language rating. I had a 3.3 in Spanish in the Q course, and they were like, "Hey man, you're going to 7th group." I didn't want to go to 7th group. My ex-wife, I had just married her. She's a glamour girl from Tokyo. And so I was like, man, I'm not taking my new wife out of her context in Hawaii where I met her to Fayetteville for her first exposure to the Army. So let me find a way into first group. So being who I am, I went over into the SWIG building, which you're all familiar with, I think. And I found the lady in comfortable shoes that does the assignments. Name was Diane something. Old black lady, right? She was nice as heck. You know who I'm talking about?
No, I don't. I have my own story of trying to get reassigned, but it was not successful. Maybe I'd share that later, but go ahead.
Well, so here's what you did wrong, man. You didn't flirt with her for 3 weeks like I did.
There you go. You played the long
So I
game.
flirted with this lady
It was
for
a
3
retired
weeks.
CW5 up in the Special Warfare building. He didn't want me flirting with him.
Yeah, probably not. That would have been a little weird back then. So yeah, I mean, I talked to her every day. I brought her popcorn, figured out she liked popcorn, and just kind of worked on the source until I was ready to pop the question. And I said, hey, listen, I want to get a first group. Here's my thing. How do I do this? I speak Spanish, and this horrible, mean captain is telling me I have to go to seventh group.
Yeah.
And I don't want to do it. And she was like, look, here's what you do. And she's stomping her feet. She goes, go take the test in Japanese. I said, but I don't speak Japanese. I want to learn Japanese. And she said, well, it doesn't matter. If you get, maybe it'll show some talent or aptitude for the language, and then we'll see what happens. So I did that. I got a 0-0. And unbeknownst to me, she put Japanese next to my name on some roster, and nobody questioned it. And next thing you know, I'm getting orders for first group. And I was like, awesome. And at the time, they were teaching Japanese in the school. And so I said, well, I want to go learn the language of my then wife,
Yeah.
And so the language slots came out, and I wasn't on it. I went back to my gal up in the Swick building, like, hey, what's the deal, man? I want to go to language school and learn Japanese. She's like, look, dude. She goes, you got Japanese and you got Spanish. So you're either going to first group without a language, or you're going to seventh group without a language. So what's it going to be? And I said, I'll shut my mouth now and move out. So I ended up in first group, and I met my colonel, and he's like, what language do you speak? I said, sir, I speak Spanish. He said, get the fuck out of here. He kicked me out of his office. That was my rival in group was getting kicked out of my battalion commander's office and sent to Tagalog language class, which I don't remember any of.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
No, in my case, I got assigned to 4th Battalion in 5th Group, so I knew I was going to have to stand up, be like one of the guys that stands up the battalion. And I knew...
I went through that in first group.
I lived off post right next to this retired CW5 who worked in the Special Forces command headquarters, and I went up there and he was like, "Okay, let me see what I can do for you, Jack." And he busts open his 3-ring binder, like, let's see, who do I know? He's trying to get me out of 5th Group, and even not necessarily get me to another group, but get me reassigned to another battalion in 5th Group. And he's going through the roster, and he's like, oh, yeah, I know this guy. Let me give him a call. And he calls up the guy, and he's like, yeah, I got this guy, Murphy. He wants to be in a different battalion. What can we do for him? He's coming to 4th. And the guy he's on the phone with is like, well, I'm the battalion commander of 4th Battalion. So if this guy's as great as you're saying he is, why do I want to reassign him? Because he's talking me up, hyping me up on the phone for like 5 minutes, and it totally blew up in both of our faces.
He probably knew what he was doing too, which is the sad thing.
That son of a bitch.
He's like, I'm going to show that motherfucker, this new guy.
Yeah, so it didn't work out in my case.
But yeah, that's the origin story. I mean, there's some fun details here and there, but being in the infantry in Hawaii was a great place to prepare for SF or SOF in general, I felt, because you can't do operations be above the company level. I mean, and even that's a stretch. So we were doing everything by platoons and squads. And to be frank, I mean, the infantrymen out in the 25th ID are well prepared. I mean, they're tough. It's tough terrain. It's tough to operate in, and it's tough just to get from place to place. The guys are hard, and they do, they apply the tactics well. So for me going to SF, it was pretty natural progression. A lot of guys in my company went SF.
When you say that you couldn't do operations or training above a certain size, is that because of the training area involved and the lack of open space there?
Exactly. Yeah. It's really extreme terrain. Really extreme. And there's not a lot of it either. So there's not a lot of open space.
So, Lino, what year is it you get to your first ODA after getting kicked out of the BC's office?
Yeah, that was 2003. So, and it was right in time. You have to remember it was February 2003. I got to the battalion, and they stuck me in the 3 shop as an AS3 for a JRTC rotation, which was preparing for something. I don't recall what. But this is the time that the invasion was happening in Iraq. Afghanistan had kicked off, and I was in training for all of that. And, we were glued to the TVs, and then in 2003, a lot of those same teams and a bunch of my buddies were getting ready to cross the border into Iraq from various parts of the world. And man, I tell you, that was hard to take. Yeah. We felt left out, out there in first group, and the leadership wanted to talk to us about the Philippines and about Thailand and how important it was that we go and teach the Thai Border Patrol Police, like instructor training course or some bullshit. Mm-hmm. It was just tough. It was tough for us as a unit, I think, to deal with that for a long time. Yeah, it was a while before they got in. There was like
major league butthurt in first group, wasn't there? Just because, at least initially, that it took them quite a while to get into the war, as I recall. I mean, what was the first group deployments to Iraq? Was it like 2005?
Well, 2nd Battalion went to Afghanistan in, I want to say it was late 2004. Uh-huh. And then 3rd Battalion, which is my battalion, we went to Iraq in early 2006.
Okay.
So, is that right? Yeah, it was early 2006. And for me, by that time, I had just gotten promoted off the team. Mm-hmm. I've been a team leader for 2 years, and I had command of a Merops team 193, and then we changed it over to Scuba 195. And so, I did that Africa thing in 2005. They actually pulled me out of there a few weeks early to go train up with a battalion to turn around and go to Iraq. So I spent 6 weeks training and sort of at home, and then turned around and did another 6-month deployment to Iraq.
All right, so let's rewind a little bit. Your first ODA you get to, it was a MAROPS, which was like working with the Zodes back in those days, right?
That's right. It was ODA 193, and we had a really, the team sergeant was a guy named John Uhrig, and John, I recommend him for your show, by the way. John's a very interesting dude, smart as all get out, really well read, loves history, a dive guy, ended up going and working for a different agency later in life. And he was a ground branch dude, I think, and did some interesting stuff. I get whispers about John here and there. And anyway, but yeah, the team hadn't been in the water for a while for whatever reason. They just, so I came in and I was like, all right, well, we don't have any specific deployments on the training schedule. Let's embrace this Merops thing and get in the water. And we spent a lot of time in the water, weeks and weeks of kayaks and boats and aircraft and motherships. And we did some fun stuff against the Coast Guard station in Seattle, which is pretty memorable. Almost getting killed by large ocean freighters in the middle of the night, stuff like that. Running into drug dealers in Boston, like on Boston whalers, like hauling ass through the Puget Sound down to Olympia with all their lights off. Like, what was that? I don't know. It looked like a Boston whaler. We did a hit against a house that was on Anderson Island prison. And Anderson Island is a state maximum security facility, and the entire island is a prison, kind of like Alcatraz, right? And they have this state-of-the-art facility on there, but it's an old place. And so there's a couple of houses, and some of the staff actually live on the island. And there's, there's a school, and there's like all these facilities to support an entire community, but there's only like 30 people that live there, and it's a controlled community, right? They're all employees of the prison. So we asked the SWAT team if we could do an ops war, like a force-on-force against them in their little shoot house on the beach, which is this beautiful little mansion right in this cove on the backside, and it used to be a brothel or something. Anyway, it's in a moon-shaped cove, and there's a big rock in the middle of it with a couple of trees on it, and there's a sea lion colony that calls this place home. And so it's covered all the time, like 24/7, with hundreds of seals and sea lions, big giant dogs with flippers. And they kind of told me, they're like, look, don't go to the island there, because it's a nature sanctuary and we're not supposed to bother the seals, right? But I was like, man, I got to put in a sniper overwatch tonight before. Where the fuck am I going to put it?
Right.
I'd put it with the seals, man. So, of course, our sniper team we borrowed from another ODA, and the guy the sniper didn't know how to swim or wasn't comfortable in the water. So I was like, dude, all right, look, we'll go out on the boats and I'll get you right to the island and you get off. But take a magazine of 9mm ball. And I'm telling you, don't worry about it. If one of those fucking dogs approaches you, don't hesitate. Just shoot it in the head. I'll deal with it later. Because I just imagine these dudes like spending 24 hours in the middle of the night, like stuck on this island without being able to swim and getting attacked by a 1,500-pound dog with flippers. How am I going to explain that to my commander? So thankfully they didn't have to shoot any SEALs, and we put red eyes on all night, and that was good. And later the cops were like, man, how did you get that intel on us? Where were you? And I was like, man, I can't say.
That's classified.
And so that's another exclusive here on the Team House is that story, because I've never told anybody that. I'll probably go to jail in Washington.
That's awesome.
Killing baby seals. Lino, you heard it here first. So, man, and then you said that the team got converted over to being a dive team.
Yeah, so we did all that stuff in the water, and in fact, let me back up a little bit. So our kind of culminating exercise there was sort of my fault. I mean, we had demonstrated all this ability in the water, so we did a full eagle rotation in 2004, and full eagle, for those that don't know, is a big full spectrum exercise, Joint Chiefs of Staff exercise in Korea. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of good training to be had, so we went over there as a battalion. And we were in Daegu, which is in the center of the peninsula, big joint Korean U.S. Air Force base there. And that's where we had our FOB. Well, my mission as an ODA was to infiltrate Kunsan Air Force Base on the Yellow Sea side, which is the west coast of Korea. This is the same coast that the Incheon landing happened on. In fact, Incheon is just a few miles north of Kunsan. And if you remember from your history, that's an area of extreme tides. And so it was a big planning exercise for MacArthur and his staff to be able to get the Marines on there. I mean, the North Koreans didn't even think it was possible. So you can imagine the kind of challenge we were dealing with a small boat. Well, we were operating off this ship called the HSV, and you've seen pictures of it. It's this giant, awesome looking catamaran. It looks like it goes about 6 million miles an hour. And it's hard as hell to get a small boat on and off of that thing with a crane, but we practiced all this, and we went out in the Yellow Sea, and we spent a couple days getting things right. And I had command of this ship, tactical control of it, and we had a Korean team on board. And there was a big drama with that, but we got them on board. And the night before the big operation, the Korean team leader comes to me and says, "Hey, Lino, how are you guys dealing with the seawall?" And I looked at him, and his name was probably Kim or Bach or whatever, and I was like, "Kim, what the fuck are you talking about, man?" And I had a 1 to 25,000 map, and that was it. And the Koreans had built this giant seawall because they were reclaiming all the land. And so Kunsan as a community, and it's a city of Kunsan and the Kunsan Air Force Base, the entire thing, and we're talking like 50 miles, have been encompassed by a giant seawall. And I'm not talking about a berm, guys. I'm talking about like 40 feet high with a 2-lane highway on top of it, closed circuit TV system, lights, the whole shebang. I mean, this was no joke. And then they were going to fill in the lagoon and make it into farmland, right? And so we had no idea. And I called back to the battalion, and I was like, "Hey, can you ask ES2 what the fucking seawall is all about?" And they had no idea.
Yeah.
RS2. And so the Koreans were like, "Geez, dude, that sucks."
Yeah. So it's
and anyway,
hook out.
Yeah, and this was the night before, so we totally had to revamp our plan and all this stuff. And so when the day came, they're still building this thing. So when the day came, we had identified there was a gap about, if I remember right, it was maybe half a mile wide, where it was the only remaining entrance and exit to the lagoon. Constricted waterways, what happens in constricted waterways? The water flows a lot faster. And so we've got these 2 loaded down Zodes with all of our equipment and all of our guys and our I think we had our big engines, but it didn't matter. I mean, we're going like 2 miles an hour. We're creeping through this thing
against the And for those who don't know, a Zodiac is a rib boat about
like a 12-man
12
boat.
A small
at best
boat,
at best. And so we're trying to go through this gap and then get to to this place where we were supposed to put a laser on a Patriot missile that was stationed there. That was our op for. And as we're in this gap and struggling to just make forward progress, one of the guys, I'll leave his name out, it rhymes with Kenny G. Kenny was like, he just started screaming, nearly threw himself out of the boat. And he started screaming, "It's a fucking submarine! It's a fucking submarine!" And I mean, all of us instantly kind of like jumped over to that side of the boat to see what he was talking about. We nearly capsized because of it. And what ended up happening is the guy who was on the tiller, he got pushed over and the tiller got stuck in his gear. And so he put us in this like giant left or right turn. I don't remember which, but it's this giant like U-turn that he made. And we went right around the conning tower of what was a submarine. And I leaned out. I could have reached out and grabbed the fucking thing that was sticking out of the water, the periscope. Now it's dark. There's lights in the background, so we don't have a lot of detailed view. But I mean, all I could think of was the back end of this thing coming and chopping our Zodiac in half.
Yeah.
In the middle of this channel where the water's flowing like a fucking river out to sea, and it's 35 degrees out. And I was like, I'm gonna fucking die here. And I gotta be honest with you guys, I didn't handle it very well. I was scared. I was like, holy shit, man, we're all gonna die here. And so after we kind of unfucked ourselves, and the other Zode came over with John Urig, and he's supposedly watching this show, and he's probably laughing his ass off right now. So John comes over in the other boat, and I was like, John, I don't want to talk about it. We're going to park this fucking thing. I got to make a report about this. So we beached the two Zodes on some rock somewhere. I don't even remember if we made it into the lagoon. And, I made a report up to the battalion, like, hey, we just ran into a fucking submarine. And, I can just imagine the howls of laughter in the FOB at that point, because, they're not going to believe that story.
That's amazing.
Yeah, they're not going to believe it. And so by that point, by the time we kind of, got hold of ourselves, or I got hold of myself, I'll go ahead and take the blame for it. It was too late. The tides had changed, and now our opportunity to go was lost. Because if you remember from the MacArthur story, it's minutes to get in and out based on those tides changing and so forth. So, we didn't make it to our objective, which is a real embarrassment for me, but that's what happened. And so the following days were sort of a blur of me receiving phone calls from very articulate Korean colonels telling me that I didn't see what I saw. And it took us a couple of days to get off the ship because we had to wait for the Korean team to do their mission the next night. And then, some travel time back to the FOB. But, for 2 days, everybody was telling me, Lino, what? You didn't see this thing. I mean, come on now. A submarine, we haven't seen one since fill in the blank. And I was like, okay, you didn't see one since then, but it's fucking here now. So, I'm just telling you what we saw, brother. Like,
so it was a North Korean sub that you almost read?
We don't know. I assume so. Right. I assume so. And we checked the depth where we were, 6 fathoms is what, 36 feet or something like that. It's not super deep. I can't imagine that it was a full size.
It was one of their midget subs, yeah.
Yeah.
I have to assume. And nobody ever told me anything.
Yeah.
Now, years later, the joint or combined forces basically just, erased this thing. They didn't really want to deal with it. And I stopped receiving those phone calls from the Korean colonels. But years later, when I was in Iraq, I was telling this story to a buddy of mine who was the 2. And he's like, I was the 4 stars interpreter, because he had been a Korean, like a Mormon missionary or something, and spoke fluent Korean. He's like, I was the 4 stars interpreter, and we absolutely fucking believed you, but the Alliance didn't want us talking about it.
Right. Well, I mean, that's the thing, is that nobody's calling you, telling you that you didn't see it, if somebody doesn't believe that you saw it.
Yeah.
You want to hear? This is a creepy story. If you've ever met Gordon Kukulu, wrote "Separated at Birth." He was a special forces officer. He was in Korea in like the 80s, the 70s and the 80s. Spent a lot of time over there, and he told me a story actually about how he was very good friends with a South Korean Special Forces NCO, really good guy. And that was like, I think, in the late 70s. And then he came back to South Korea in the 80s, and he was asking about his friend, making inquiries. Like, where's my boy Kim? Where's he at? And he even had, like, he knew what year he went to the military academy. He had his serial number, because they were pen pals. They'd write back and forth to each other. And these, like, very stern-faced Korean officers would come to him, like, we've never heard of this person. He never served in the Korean military. And they're like, no, I know this guy. I have his serial number right here. This is his address where I used to write to him. Like, we never heard of this person. He doesn't exist. And he said he found out through the grapevine way later. They sent him on some bullshit intel op into North Korea, like as undercover, as like commercial cover, as a businessman or something like that. And dude just vanished over there.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. That's interesting. I actually have a friend who went over there, which is not my story, but it's interesting stuff. She was a U.S. military major at the time, Air Force. Back when there was a joint hotel complex near the border. That caused a bit of a flap.
Was that when they were going over there trying to like negotiate the return of our MIAs?
I think that's a continuous process, Jack. That has never really ceased. So yeah, I mean, the short answer is yes, but there was, the Sunshine Policy. They had created this, tourist zone over there. It was mostly run by South Koreans because they knew how to run stuff. But you can imagine it was just a very tightly controlled facade. And so, she was studying in South Korea on a scholarship. And was like, well, I've got this opportunity to go. And she asked somebody, she ended up asking like the ops NCO at the embassy, hey, you think this is cool? Do I need to tell anybody? She's like, don't worry about it. I'll let them know. She went to fucking North Korea overnight.
Holy shit.
Yeah. Anyway, that kind of blew up on her.
So that's fascinating that you guys had that encounter and they tried to like keep it as quiet as they possibly could.
Yeah, I'm wondering, how much trouble I'm going to be in just for telling that story. But I don't know what they made of it. I don't know if the intelligence determined for sure whether or not it was a North Korean vessel or maybe one of ours. They tried to tell me at one point that it was one of ours. This Korean dude's like, nah, that's definitely one of yours. Stop fucking around. And I was like, okay. I mean, maybe it is. I don't know. You tell me.
Right.
Yeah, it's like you had a UFO sighting and everyone starts pointing fingers and stuff like that. No, you didn't see that. Nah, leave it alone.
Yeah, I actually wonder sometimes, what the other guys on the team, are saying about it years later, because memories are funny,
Right.
And it makes sense that the North Koreans would want to keep tabs on, as enemies would, any enemy does, they keep track of large military formations in training exercises like Full Eagle. And the North Koreans mobilize their forces to try to match our forces on the other side of the DMZ. So it's like this little, big dick competition to see, how many troops can you put in the field for this exercise. So it makes sense that they would be out there playing fuck around at that time.
Yeah, I mean, the IPB on that couldn't have been that hard. I mean, look, we've got a U.S. and a Korean team going to do something in Kunsan. The only way to get in there is through this gap in the berm. Let's plant some eyes right where we know they're going to be.
Right. Well, on top of that, if I knew our long-term enemy, immortal foe, were building basically a wall, why not go in, plant explosive charges in that wall while it's being built, and then DD Mao, get out and you have it for a rainy day, If you ever decide you want to take that wall down once they build that up and you want to invade. So,
yep.
So South Korea, check your wall.
Yeah. Yeah. You better make an inspection.
Better check that wall.
And so that was Full Eagle, and I went right from there directly to Malaysia for a J set, which was an interesting one because we had done, if I remember right now, we had done a site survey for a thing with the police, which was, I don't know how it works in other theaters, but these were the counter narcotics missions under the auspices of the DEA and JADF West. And so these were called Baker missions, and those were good because they had a bigger budget, and we could buy a bunch of bullshit for the team room. But there was a balance mission, which was a J set, a traditional one, mill to mill J set, with another team from another battalion going on at about the same time. Well, that other team had some issues in Thailand. One of their guys ended up getting locked up on suspicion of espionage. And so
is this when the tough box of camo gear went missing?
That sounds about right. Yeah, it was definitely camo gear, and there was a.
I heard this one.
Yeah, there was some. Anyway, I don't know.
There was a woman in the hotel room, supposedly. Yeah.
Yeah, something like that. And anyway, so the Echo went to jail. And anyway, so that for whatever reason they combined this into a 2-team mission, probably because they didn't want these other guys by themselves unsupervised so shortly after having all these investigations conclude and losing their Echo, et cetera, et cetera. Turns out they were a really good team. And, for the guys that know which team that is, you guys were great. A lot of mature dudes on that team, and I think they learned some good lessons from the trouble that they had. Their team leader went on to become battalion command, and so good on them. But we joined them on this balance mission directly after coming out of Korea, where it was freezing ass cold, and then it was 128 degrees in the shade in Malaysia, and that was a fun time. We were teaching the Malaysian Rangers how to shoot and do a lot of stress tests and a little bit of urban warfare, and then they took us into the jungle and showed us the O-shaped ambush, which I thought was just amazing. Never heard of that technique in my life, but they assured me they killed a lot of communists that way. But anyway, yeah, it was fun. Lots of. There was a time where Kenny G cut off the King's motorcade, and we had a wreck. It was a whole thing.
You guys had a wreck with the King's motorcade, or
Yeah, we did.
How did that go down through the diplomatic channels? That could
it actually. I don't think that vehicle was part of the actual motorcade, but what happened was the King was visiting that camp to visit something, and we were trying to leave, and so we were in a rush, and our only Griffin Group driver graduate guy was at the wheel. He's like, "I can make it. I can make it." And he pulls out and he cuts off the King's motorcade, and he's like, "I got this." And then he freaked out and decided to get out of their way, and he hit a parked car on the side of the road. And so, yeah. Fun times. We didn't have any problems with that. It was just a fender bender.
So when did the team make this conversion then to becoming a dive team?
It was in, let's see, so Full Eagle's in 2004. I was told during Full Eagle, I think, that we were going to convert the team to a second paid dive team. So for those that don't know, most SF battalions, well, the MTO says each company has a dive team. SF has never been able to fill those dive teams and has only had the money to pay one per battalion because there's quite a specialty skill additional pay associated with diving. So at a certain point, there was a decision made that they had the money. The GWAT was raging. We had all kinds of money. We had the money, and we were going to pay a second dive team per battalion. And so with all this experience in the water, despite the Korean sub thing, they said, "Okay, Lino's the best guy, the best team. Go to dive school and become 195." So we did that, and most of our guys went to dive school, including myself, got qualified, and we became 195 one day. It was like, okay, you guys are your 195 go.
So on the last episode, we had Mike Edwards on, who is a military freefall instructor, and we talked about the infiltration technique. And I'd like to hear from you, especially your work with the Combat Diver Foundation, about this technique, about the combat diver infiltration technique, its viability in current times. Because I mean, we could ask some very pointed questions, right?
Sure.
Yep. When was the last time this technique was actually used? Like, what's its relevancy on the battlefield today?
No, and those are all valid questions. And the short answer is I don't know when the last time it was used in operations. We had teams that tried to use it a couple times in Iraq and were basically told not to bother. I do know of some JSOC teams that have done some stuff. Mm-hmm. There were not SEALs that did some dive work, but it's rare, right? So it's the big question, and the dive community in SF has gone through this soul searching a couple of times. It sort of ebbs and flows. There are times in our history where we did not teach the guys how to dive rebreathers because it's expensive. It takes training time, maintenance, equipment, all that stuff, and they stopped training our guys in rebreather ops. And then, a few years later, another commander comes in and says, no, actually, we need this. And so it's like a cyclical sort of effect. My argument here, when it comes to the dive capability, is that it is necessary. One, just to maintain our credibility as a full spectrum special operations force. And, we can make the cheap argument that on the SF patch, the unit patch, you've got sea, air, and land. Well, if we take that dive thing out of there, we're kind of like air and land guys, to be honest. So the more intellectual argument is, for our own credibility with all these other soft forces around the world that do have this capability, we need to at least know what we're talking about. But there's a second kind of 30s in all these places we need to operate that you're going to see Navy SEALs and Green Beret combat divers doing this against targets. It's just there's not enough of us, so we've got to be able to train other guys to do it. And there are JSETs where that's the POI is diving.
So you think that the viability, the importance of having combat dive teams is sort of similar to what the SIF did, the Commanders in Extremis Force, that, they never really got used as an in extremis force, but they were quite helpful and useful in going abroad and training foreign counterterrorism units.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And I think it's true of dive teams as well. Now, let's take that a step further. You're complicating adversary planning by just maintaining this capability.
Right.
And maintaining it at a certain scale. Right. So if you're the Indo-PACOM commander, you're going to want as many dive qualified guys out there training as many dive qualified locals as you can to complicate that adversary planning. So do I think that Green Berets are going to be doing dive infiltrations and direct action kind of roles in anytime soon? It's going to be extremely rare. It could happen, major theater war against a pure competitor. Sure. You're going to get a couple of those. But more importantly, you're complicating that adversary planning.
You talked about rebreathers. So if we can kind of back up real quick, because this is something we haven't really covered on the show, I think, is what is a combat diver? What are rebreathers? Why can't you guys just go take a PADI course and, what's the difference?
Yeah. So I'll take your last question first. So why can't we just do a PADI course? I mean, PADI course is basically just to get people used to breathing off of compressed air and getting underwater and then coming back up. So we need to be able to do a little bit more than that: search dives, navigation, night, rescue dives. So, I mean, that's pretty obvious, right? Mm-hmm. But that's all on what they call an open circuit scuba system. Bubbles come out. Mm-hmm. You're breathing actual air, the same mixture that we breathe as we're sitting here talking. Bubbles come out of the rig. Well, you can imagine that bubbles coming out of a rig is going to be problematic if you're trying to sneak into some place that's being actively protected. So then we've adopted the rebreather technology. The specific rebreathers that militaries around the world use are O2 only systems. So pure oxygen, your body oxygen, and the only byproduct is pure carbon dioxide. And there's a process you have to go through to purge the nitrogen out of that system before you actually get under the water, so that O2 gets used by your cells, and then CO2 is expelled. The CO2 is removed by a chemical scrubber that's contained in the housing on the front of the rebreather. So no bubbles at all. Your standard commercial rebreathers do actually have bubbles. So most of those are nitrox or some other mixed gas rebreather. There are less bubbles, but there are bubbles. O2 systems are the only ones that don't have bubbles at all. And that's why militaries use them. The drawback is O2 is poisonous below a certain depth.
Right.
And so there are limitations on, your operational parameters with using a rebreather.
So like when you're using a rebreather, you're like, what, 30 feet underwater maybe?
That's a max.
Yeah.
That's a max you can go.
One atmosphere, 33 feet is where you start to encounter oxygen toxicity.
We have talked a little bit on this show in episodes way back about Navy divers and guys who do like all kinds of cool espionage stuff off of subs and everything. And they're on they're saturation divers, right?
Yeah, and those are usually like some sort of surface supply or
mixed
contained.
gas.
But for combat diving, for that, you cannot go below 33 feet. So you have to be trained at maintaining, you have to be deep enough to maintain that stealth and no visible profile. But also you can't go too deep, because that's when you start to encounter oxygen toxicity, and it becomes poisonous to the body.
Yep. Yeah. That's the short story. Now, there are a few other things that can kill you with a rebreather, and some other things that can just, cause your mission to fail. So it's a very complicated system to learn how to use. That said, again, an O2 rebreather is absolutely critical for a military dive capability, because you can't sneak into places when you got a bunch of bubbles coming up. So yeah, it's tough. I think SF, and this is the point of the story, SF needs to maintain the capability for those three reasons. One, for our own credibility. Two, so we can do the FID mission as required. And then three, to complicate that adversary planning. Those once-in-a-lifetime dive infiltration, go blow up the president's yacht kind of fantasy stories like the SEALs had in Panama. Maybe it'll happen someday. Yeah, sure. But that's going to be rare.
You're crushing my soul, Lino. Like I was a free fall guy, but there's still that little like commando inside me that's like, man, I want Green Berets to, do subsurface ops and go like blow up oil infrastructure or take down a bridge or rescue a prisoner or something cool like that.
It could happen. If the conflict's big enough and the SEALs are busy and the best way to get in is a underwater infiltration, then it could happen. And we need to be ready for
it. I again, maybe I'm engaging in like fantasy here, but you could use it to infiltrate an ODA to go and do the traditional unconventional warfare mission potentially, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, that's probably where we spend most of our training time in the water when it comes to underwater ops. And you'll see this in the school, and I did it with my company when I was a company commander. It is, getting dropped off behind a terrain feature somewhere. By a helicopter or by a mothership, going subsurface and navigating, and there might be a dog leg in there. You don't want the navigation to be too complicated because it's a lot harder underwater.
Right.
Make a dog leg around the island and hit the beach. And the idea is to just get there so you can do the UW mission long term. So yeah, we like to say also what distinguishes us from the SEALs is that we really view the underwater operation as a way to get to work. It's not the operation in and of itself.
Right.
So is there truth to that? Sure. I think so,
So when you guys converted as a team to a dive team, pre-scuba is notoriously hard. It's one of the reasons why they have, people have a hard time filling those scuba slots. And the combat diver course itself, apparently, I haven't been, but apparently it's very, very difficult. How does that work as a team, though, so that you don't lose the guys who may not be great at be great in that field?
I mean, we lost them. And that's the short story is we did lose those guys. There were some guys that just straight up refused to go to pre-scoop. That was not for them, and they knew it, and nobody really gave them shit about it. They were good operators, and we didn't want to see them leave. But, if you're going to be a dive team, you got to man up and do it. So we lost some of them, and it took a while to get new guys in that were either willing and capable of getting through the school or had already been qualified. It took some time. I think we did our first reasonable dive ops about 6 months later.
So what was the point where I thought it was a very interesting story about how you got hit up and briefed on a very secretive operation to go into North Africa? I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, that was sort of a really kind of fun moment for me as an SF guy. I got to caveat this with, I don't remember everything that was classified, so I'll be very careful how I tell the story, and I'll try to not to deviate from too much from what I've already written. I was went out to Yakima Training Center to prepare a team to go to Iraq or Afghanistan, one of those two. We were going to spend a month out at Yakima, which, if you're familiar with it, is just high desert. Beautiful place, great training area, lots of space. You can do just about everything out there. But there's no trees or anything. It's desert. And I literally drove out to Yakima in my truck and met another company in the battalion and was going to, I wasn't training with them. I was like an OC or whatever. I was helping their company commander sort that out. And because of my combination of training and clearances, I got a call from some guy in the group whatever shop one day while I was out there, the second day I was there. And and he was like, "Hey, this is Chief so-and-so." I knew who he was. And he was like, is this Captain Miani? I was like, "Yeah, who's this?" He's like, "Yeah, this is so-and-so." And he said, "You need to report to the group headquarters tomorrow for a mission." It's like, "I got a mission. I'm out here in Yakima helping Whitey with this, get his company ready for whatever." And they're like, "No, you don't understand. You're being redirected. Come home and we'll see you in the 3 shop tomorrow morning." I'm like, "All right, what's this about?" He goes, "I can't tell you." I'm like, "What? Come on, man. What do you mean you can't tell me? What is this?" Like, I've been doing this a while, man. This is bullshit. He's like, "No, I can't fucking tell you. Get your shit and show up. You're going to be gone for 6 months and you're leaving like tomorrow." Like, come on, man. This is not real. And he said, "I'll see you at group tomorrow." So sure enough, like I drove back I told Whitey, I'm like, "Hey man, I got to leave." He's like, "What the fuck?" And he's kind of a hothead. So he's like, "Fuck you, Miani." All right. Okay. Sorry, Major. So I drove back to group, and the next day I showed up and they're like, "Hey, there's a fight between combatant commanders about filling this mission for Sakir." Sakir was the headquarters I was running this thing. And we can't tell you where you're going to go, but you've got to go to Sakir. And they're going to tell you, what you need to know, and good luck. I was like, what fucking climate do I pack for? Because they gave me a list. They're like, it could be Chad, it could be Tanzania, it could be Georgia. I'm like, Georgia? Right. Tanzania? I'm like, do I pack winter shit or do I pack like my sun hat? Like, what? And they wouldn't tell me. I mean, seriously, they wouldn't tell me. And I was like, all right. So we managed to get it delayed a little bit, and I left 9 days later. And it was a small group of us. It was 5 of us, I think, from first group. And the reason we got selected, again, was as a combination of clearances and training, but also we were in first group, man. Everybody else was fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq by this point, and we're busy. Mm-hmm. And I guess, the powers that be were like, well, first group's not fucking doing anything, so, send them. I was happy as shit to go because I was like, yeah, I'm doing something no one else is doing. This sounds cool, secret mission, Had to tell my wife at the time, like, hey, baby, I can't tell you where I'm going. I'm going away for 6 months, I'll send you a postcard.
I'm sure she did that.
And it was legit. Like Sakir, and they hadn't really. What ended up being was they hadn't decided where they were going to send it. And so, one thing of secrecy, and I'm kind of deflating my own stories here, but it wasn't as much secrecy as it was they just hadn't decided yet. So I ended up in Chad. So we went to Sakir and we received the mission and we got a whole bunch of information, spent some days. And there's a funny kind of side story in there is that because this was so last minute, I actually had to call my family and tell them that I was going to miss my sister's graduation from West Point. And I was going to miss also that same weekend my father's retirement from 35 years in the Army or 33 years in the Air Force. And so it was like this huge family event that was taking place in Virginia and in West Point. I was going to miss it all. And so that weekend, and it was like Memorial Day weekend, the Chadians had gotten into a spat with the Americans about visas. And so they refused to give us a visa. And so the sergeant major who was in charge of this program, TFO guy, anyway, he was like, look, we can't get you a visa, just go enjoy the weekend. See you on Tuesday. And so I kind of, everybody left and I closed the door and I was like, hey, Sergeant Major, man, look, here's what's going on. My sister's graduating from West Point tomorrow. My dad's retiring the next day from 33 years in the Army or the Air Force. Can I go to the States? I'll be back on Tuesday, I promise. And he's like, no. And I went, okay. Special ops, got it. We're going to go kill terrorists or whatever. This is important shit. Okay, I'm not going. And then he calls me back like 5 minutes later. He's like, look, dude, get on the plane, go to your sister's graduation, fucking be back here on Tuesday. I was like, I won't let you down. So I went, and because I was TDY and they didn't have any control of me and all this, he's like, look, I can't sign your leave form. I don't even want to tell Sakir or First Group that you're leaving. Just be back here on Tuesday, man.
Don't get in trouble.
Yeah. And I was like, I won't let you down, Sergeant Major. And I fucking went AWOL. AWOL and flew to fucking New York. And I surprised my sister, my whole family in New York at her graduation. So I got to see those because of a visa dispute.
That's awesome.
Yeah, so you're supposed to, you're like read on to some TSSCI, compartmentalized program, and like, yeah, fuck that. I'm going to go see my sister graduate from West Point. And then you have to haul your ass all the way back to Europe so you can go do this thing.
Yep. And I did that. So I showed up on Monday night or Tuesday morning, whatever it was. And probably the next day we got on a plane and we flew to Chad. And it was me and one other dude. And as you saw reading in my writing there, our mission was basically to find bad guys. Now, here's where it got interesting for us is that this was a EUCOM mission. At the time, AFRICOM didn't exist.
Right.
And 10th Group had, basically the responsibility for doing this. But they were busy in Afghanistan and Iraq and elsewhere.
In Afghanistan.
Yeah. So it was for them, it wasn't something they really wanted to do, but it was the EUCOM commander's kind of baby. Mm-hmm. Now, the SOCOM commander, apparently, and I'm being told this secondhand, but the SOCOM commander had basically said, no, this is my mission. Donald Rumsfeld said, we are going to field these missions, and this is a SOCOM mission. So the two 4-stars were at odds about what the actual mission was. And so our guys in the Sakir shop that we were working for were like, look, you're there to find terrorists and prepare the infrastructure for, if we have to go in there and get their asses. Whereas the SOCOM commander had a more kind of general and really boring sort of view on things. But EUCOM commander was all about it. So we kind of embraced that. And we went downrange with the mission of trying to find bad dudes. And that was great. I had a bunch of money and I had a couple of small guns and a bunch of weird commo shit. And my job was to talk to people and see if I could find bad guys. And I got to tell you, my nearest boss was a continent away. And my only link to him occasionally was a sat phone that I wasn't supposed to have. And I ran around surviving on my wits. And Jack, I know from reading your book, you can kind of appreciate that. It was like, man, nobody's coming to help me out if I get in the clink.
Right.
I get my ass in a sling. It's just me. No one's coming.
It was you and one NCO, right? And
there's one NCO. Yep.
But then there were times, if you want to talk about that, extenuating circumstances where really you literally were by yourself.
Yeah, that was an interesting bit. So we had, well, let me back up just a bit. So when I first got there, it was early June or late May, 2005. And, you know, the war's raging in Iraq. It's raging in Afghanistan. And we're starting to find there was a terrorist group called the GSPC that was operating in the French parts of Algeria and Libya. And this was led by a guy named Mokhtar Belmokhtar, who later became even more famous. But the French and the Americans were looking for this dude for a decade prior to him hitting the news. And we knew they were funneling foreign fighters for their own reasons into Iraq, and they were doing their own bad stuff in Libya and Algeria. This was while Gaddafi was still around, before it got really bad. And so we got on the ground, and I remember taking an opportunity to go out to the Sudanese border, which was where a lot of the trouble was, before we were really ready to do it. And so there's a lot of paperwork you have to do to travel in Chad, because they're constantly afraid of coups and whatnot, and rightly so. I mean, their history is full of that stuff. And so we didn't have all our paperwork in order. We didn't have a good solid feel for even like where we lived and how to drive around the capital city. But the defense attaché was going out to this border town for whatever unrelated reason. And so I told Sergeant Mike, I was like, Mike, man, we're going. He's like, we're not ready. And I said, fuck it, we're going. Because if we wait till we're ready, we're never going to go. Mm-hmm. So here's an opportunity. If shit gets, screwy, defense attaché will be out there, and we have him to fall back on at a minimum, which ain't much, but I mean, something. So let's go. And we did it. And we ended up, it's a 2-day drive across this country. People don't realize how big Africa is. It's fucking enormous. Chad, the country of Chad, is north to south as big as the United States, the continental United States. And when you throw in the fact that there's absolutely, there's only 80 kilometers of paved roads in the entire country, it's a bit of a daunting thing. And so there were some adventures that we had the first time, because we didn't know what we were doing. But we were SF dudes, we can get through anything, right? I was behind the wheel, and we had this Land Cruiser, and we stole these civil affairs guys that were down there for flintlock because nobody was using them and they had money. So it was me and Mike and these two civil affairs dudes, one of whom is a 1-star now. I'm behind the wheel, and I'm on this Land Cruiser, and it's this hardball road out of the capital towards the eastern part of the country, which is where we were heading. And I'm going 100K. 60 miles an hour. And there's all these derelict vehicles on the side of the road where, when you break down in Chad, there's no towing company that comes and sorts you out.
Right.
It's one of your buddies walking his ass back to the capital and buying a part and then coming back 3 days later. And so what we were seeing is all these derelict vehicles with little groups of people standing around them doing nothing. And I'm going 100K, having a good old time. We got the music cranking, and the air conditioner wasn't working, but whatever. And I see this, that the road ends, and there's a construction barrier. And so I'm studying this thing at 100K, and I'm like, okay, which side of the barrier am I going to go off of to enter the desert and the tracks into the desert? So I'm totally focused on it, and I'm ignoring the vehicle with the guys standing around it. And there was a rumor of a coup that week. And so the Presidential Guard was out there pulling patrols and shaking people down, just trying to make sure that the rebels weren't coming. But I didn't realize that they had fucking AKs and were wearing uniforms. And so as I approached this group at somewhere just south of 100K, I see a guy going like this and holding an AK-47 in his other hand. And I'm like, why the fuck's that guy waving at me? And it just didn't register, I'm focusing on driving this vehicle, and he's going like this. And suddenly, when it finally clicked, is when he raised the AK and aimed it straight at my face. And I hit the brakes because I knew who they were instantly at that point. It finally, the light came on, and I hit the brakes. And these dudes are pissed, that they thought they were going to have to slag down some vehicle, and we stopped. So they come over and they're sort of yelling at me in this Chatty and Arabic French mix that none of us speak. Like the sergeant from the E7 from the civil affairs, he was like, "Yeah, I had a French class once," So he was trying to speak French to him, and I had some classes before we went out. And I was like, "Oh my god!" And they're yelling at us, I'm like, holy shit, man, And so finally we communicated that we're from the diplomatic corps because we had DC plates on the vehicle. And, we were going to Abishay, which is the town on the frontier. It's like the gateway to the frontier out there. And at that point they start laughing, and they're laughing at us because they're like, man, I know what they're thinking. They're like, these idiots are going to get fucked up. There's no way they're making it to Abishay. These fucking morons. So they're like, all right, they waved us through, and we were like, whew, we didn't get shot today. But that's how Chad was, man. You run into people with guns, and just life is cheap, dude. They don't care. I mean, the greatest defense we had, and I'm not being facetious here, was our white skin, because they knew that if they gunned down a gringo, man, they were going to have serious problems. But if you're average Chadian and you look at them wrong, or you drive a little too fast at the checkpoint, you're getting your ass fucking shot.
Yeah.
And so it was dangerous as hell, because it was just the four of us, and later it was just two of us, and then eventually just me. But that's how Africa is, man. We used to say it's not for pussies, and that was no joke. Africa was rough, and it was just us, and all we had was like a 9mm that we weren't supposed to have, and a sat phone we weren't supposed to have. So anyway, going back to your original question, which how did I end up alone? On one of our later trips, we were like, the rainy season had started, and so we didn't want to drive because it was just a mud slog for 2 days across the desert. And I said, all right, well, we've got a pretty hefty op fund. Let's rent a plane. And we kind of were interested in the gentleman who owned the planes anyway. And so we rented a plane, and the next day, the Chadian government decided they were going to get into the business of licensing aircraft, something that they had never bothered to do, because before the French just handled it. And let's face it, the Chadians really didn't know what they were doing when it came to that anyway, but they decided they were going to make money doing this. So they told our French friend, who had some amazing stories, by the way, about getting his throat slit in Beirut and doing some other shit. He's French operator of some variety, I'm sure. And he was real. I mean, he had the scar, and he just the look and the I know a bullshit story when I see it. Anyway, so we show up at the guy's office, on the airfield the next day for our flight. He's like, well, listen, Chadians just told me I can't fly any of my aircraft except for this one, and there's only 3 seats in it, and that's for the pilot, one of you, and 2 out of the 3 of you, because I had an interpreter. That's a whole nother story. I went to the embassy, and I was like, I'm not going out there again without a terp.
Yeah.
And they said, we got just the guy. And this was a lady in the pole mill section who had worked with, her job was negotiating Sudanese rebels and trying to negotiate the peace agreement with the Sudanese government. So they were all sheltering in Chad. So the embassy in Chad was negotiating all that. And she's like, yeah, he's a Sudanese rebel, but, he speaks English pretty well. And I was like, no, not him. And she goes, well, we got this other guy. She's just clueless, I'm like, I'm not like going out there with a rebel who's wanted by the fucking Sudanese Zagawa tribe or whatever, that's where I'm going. And so she's like, yeah, we got this other guy. He showed up. He's working with Flintlock. Flintlock is the big Joint Chiefs of Staff exercise that happens across the Sahel every year. I said, okay, all right, this guy's working with SS teams in Flintlock. He's got to be legit. Well, when I met him and I dug into his story, it turns out he was a lieutenant colonel in the Chadian Air Force when they had planes, and hadn't been paid in years. And one day he said, I can't feed my family anymore. I'm defecting to Cameroon. And so he took his C-130 and flew it to fucking Cameroon and was like, here I am. What can I do for you? And I'm a Chadian colonel. And they had 2 C-130s at one time. And so he had been all over the world with the Chadian president, had an actual passport with stamps in it from all over the place. And on top of that, he was a Muslim, but he had converted from a Christian tribe. So he wasn't part of the hierarchy of power out there. And it was just, he was an interesting guy, right? And so one day, the Chadian government convinced him to come back to Cameroon. Please come back. We'll pay you. We promise we won't kill you for defecting to Cameroon. And he actually came back, and they actually didn't kill him.
Wow.
Yeah, it was quite the story. And then 6 months later, they stopped paying him again. And he was like, I need something to do. And he walked into the U.S. Embassy and literally knocked on the glass at post 1 or whatever they call it, the security gate there. And it was like, he put up his passport. He's like, I was trained how to fly in the United States. I'm a lieutenant colonel in the Chadian Air Force, and I need work. I speak English. And they put him to work with flintlock. And that was his whole vetting. And this is the guy I ended up with. And he was a good dude, but I was like, good grief, guys. This is what the U.S. Embassy was rocking with out there.
So you got this guy who was a C-130 pilot / defector as your terp. You got the French pilot who was some kind of merc or French Foreign Legion bro cruising around Lebanon back in the day with a gnarly tattoo or a gnarly scar on his throat from where somebody tried to do him in. In a rickety airplane with 3 seats that is supposed to take you to your area of operation.
Right, and it's supposed to be me, Mike, the terp, and the pilot. So you see there's a seat missing.
Right.
So me and Mike on the spot were like, well, let's do some cross-loading real quick. I mean, it was like the Q course. It was like, all right, what do we, how do we cross-load the equipment here, quickly? Like, we're moving shit between boxes and bags and whatever. And I was like, I'll go. And I don't remember my justification, but we decided that I would go first, and then I would send the plane back, and then Mike would come later. Well, that plan worked until the weather moved in, and they had to turn around because of a thunderstorm. Then the next day, some guy got blown up by a mine on a mine clearing operation in the north, so they got commandeered to go medevac that dude, and then weather the next day. The point of all this is, as soon as you turn props on a bird, you paid for it. So we ran out of money. So after 3 days of literally sitting under a bush in fucking eastern Chad in the middle of nowhere, waiting for Mike and attracting all kinds of attention because, I mean, gringos sitting under a bush, looking at the grass grow. I'm not kidding. I'm not exaggerating, not one bit when I tell you, like, dudes would come up on donkeys and just stop and get off the donkey and fucking sit with me. And they'd be wearing like man dresses and they'd have no teeth and they'd have like AK-47s and shit. And they'd be like, they wouldn't even talk to me. They'd just sit down and they'd watch the grass grow. And that's what you do when you're a man in Chad. You ride around on a donkey and you look at the grass grow, I guess, and check out the gringos. And so for 3 days, I kind of did that. And there's a side story to that too. So the French guy was, had a lot of shady connections and thought we were up to some sneaky shit. I don't know why he thought that. He tried to sell us armored vehicles at one point, which we didn't go for. But he's like, "Listen, you're going out to this place. This town was called Reba." And he's like, "Look, I want you when you go to Reba, the guy in charge is Abdulaziz, and Abdulaziz is like." He used to work for the president, but he killed the wrong guy and he got exiled out to his hometown in Ariba. And he's just like cooling his heels out there until he can rejoin the government because it was a big scandal. You get it. You understand. He's like, you've got to meet Abdulaziz. And I'm like, I do not want to fucking meet Abdulaziz. But the French guy thinks I need to meet him. He's a power player out there. I mean, I guess I should meet Abdulaziz. So on day 2, sitting by the airfield, no kidding, this gold package, like spotless, shiny gold package Land Cruiser rolls up with tinted windows. And I'm like, I guess Abdulaziz knows I'm here.
Yeah.
And sure as shit, man, these dudes got out of the vehicle and they're all like, they're right out of Hollywood, guys. I mean, the aviator sunglasses, the turban, the man dress, the fucking AK-47, like the weird, useless bandolier of ammo that I don't even know what it was for. I'm like, where's your belt-fed weapon that you've got that, just... Right. The pearl-handled pistols and like the rounds in the belt.
It's like a scene out of The Mandalorian.
Yeah, I'm telling you, I was like, I don't know if Hollywood imitated art or art. I don't know, man. It imitated real life. Did I say that right? Anyway, these guys were right out of Central Casting. I'm like, you've got to be shitting me. This must be Abdulaziz. And he gets out. He's like this big, fat, gregarious dude. He's like, ha, 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 I'm Abdulaziz.
Yeah.
You must be Lino. You know, I don't remember if he said it in English or French or what the fuck, but the message was clear. And I'm like, yeah, and you must be Abdulaziz. And so he like, you know, he motions to his men and they go into his Land Cruiser and they open up the fridge. And they pull out like juices because, you know, they don't drink because they're all good Muslims and all that. And so there we are, like sipping on like Capri Suns by the airfield with the guy and the donkey. And there's, you know, Abdulaziz and 2 or 3 of his henchmen. And we're sitting around. He's trying to talk to me and I'm trying to talk to him. And it's just not working. And it's just uncomfortable as shit. Mm-hmm. You know, and I don't really want Abdulaziz up in my stuff. And I don't know what he can bring for me. And I just wasn't great, man. It wasn't a great feeling at all. And I remember thinking, like, okay, Abdulaziz is talking about some bullshit, and I'm like, okay, what do I do if this goes bad? Mm-hmm. You know, I've got a Camelback with a 9mm and 2 magazines. You know, here, like, it's not even fast to get that stuff out. And then even if I manage to get the weapon into operation, you know, okay, putting 2 in Abdulaziz first. That's a given. But that guy looks tougher than that dude. So I'm killing him second and then him. And then, you know, what am I going to do about this dude on the donkey?
Right.
The
He's just
guy
like
on
this
the
random
donkey,
guy.
You know, why's he got to go?
Well, I didn't but I had to go through that calculation. Like, what do I do about this dude? You know, and then there's my driver who was from the president's tribe and I didn't fucking trust him. And so I'm like, you know, and my every day was like that in Africa. It's like, you know, I walk into anywhere and it was like, okay, who do I whack first? You know, if the shit goes bad, I don't want to kill anybody, but damn, dude, you know? And then what do I do? You know, how am I going to run from this place? Right. Who do I call or how? You know, fuck. You know, where do I expect all the checkpoints to be? Because they're in every fucking town. So yeah, it was stressful as hell. And finally, Abdulaziz left and I got a call from Mike that day and he's like, dude, we don't have enough money to make it. You're on your own. And I remember sitting there under that bush and I was like, it was daunting for a second. You know, I was like, holy shit, man. I came out here we were supposed to be together on a 10-day trip on the Sudanese frontier, man, the seam between CENTCOM and EUCOM, and a dangerous freaking place because this is where all the rebellions originated. And this is bad tribe territory. And I don't know much about it. So, yeah, it was daunting for a second. I was like, damn. And then I stopped and I said, well, I mean, this is what they trained me to do. So time to get to it. You know, I mean, all right, it could be fucking dangerous, but this is what we're supposed to do.
Right.
So I spent the next 10-ish days kind of by myself traveling that whole border and doing key leader engagements and spending money and talking to people. And there's just a lot of wacky stuff. You know, I remember going into a quote unquote restaurant in the middle of the bleakest desert and seeing a picture. I wish I had my camera wasn't working at the time. 2 posters on the wall. And so when you walk out of the desert into these mud huts, it's dark as shit. You can't see anything, right? And I get escorted to like the plastic furniture they have, and they asked me, you know, what I wanted, and I knew how to order one thing, and it had beans in it. So I ordered that. You know, I'm fucking starving, but I ordered beans. And my eyes start to adjust, and there's these 2 squares on the wall in front of me, and they're posters. And as I start to make out what they are, one of them's 50 Cent, the rap guy. And the other one's Osama bin Laden. And I'm like, they're kind of looking at each other like they're in love, you know, just by coincidence, these 2 posters were staring, like facing each other. It was Osama and 50 Cent. And I was like, God damn it, man. I bought these bullshit batteries in the market and they don't work. And I can't take a picture of that.
It's surreal.
It was just,
yeah,
it was wild stuff, man.
So on this trip, I know you probably can't like name names, but did you identify bad guys?
No, man.
Damn it.
No, we had whispers that we were tracking down, but mostly what we were trying to do at that point was develop a network of people that we could count on.
Mm-hmm.
In case, a bad guy did get identified through some means.
Laying the groundwork.
Yeah. And then someone had to come in and deal with it. Yeah, we were laying the groundwork.
Lino, and it's just you and this driver, so we went from you sitting on the side of the road or sitting sitting by a bush. How did you make your way across the frontier over 10 days? How did you negotiate that? How did you Yeah,
that's a good question. I actually went to the governor in Ariba, this town, which was a district, like a governorship. And I asked the local warlord governor guy to rent a car from him. And, it came with the driver. And I didn't want the driver. I was like, I can drive myself and I can navigate. And he's like, no, look, dude, you really need to have the driver. And I said, I pondered that for a second and I made a risk calculation. I was like, okay, I'm going to take the driver. He's from the Zagawa tribe, which is the president's tribe. And, maybe he can help us out of a snag. And that proved to be mostly a good decision. He helped us procure some stuff along the way. Lodging, for example. So, we stayed in houses that belonged to people he knew. And he was kind of a playboy. So he would disappear at night and go, meet his girlfriends or whatever. But it was stressful as shit, man. I'm telling you, I'm sleeping with a 9mm under my pillow, quite literally, and with one eye open, trying, hoping this dude isn't going to double cross us, and for whatever fucking reason, money or who knows what, and sleeping on concrete floors and these really shithole houses, just trying to, make it to the next sun up. But we got to places like Tine, which is a border town shared with Sudan, and I was hosted there by the mayor, and that's where I kind of got tangled up with their fists. I later met the Sultan of Dartama, and because what you had to do in Chad in certain places, you had to go talk to the governor, talk to the Sultan, who was the sort of traditional leadership that was a parallel structure within the French colonial kind of enterprise. And then you could go talk to everybody below. Once you had their sort of hominis dominus, you could go do that. And I got that advice from someone that had been there for a while, and it proved to be good advice. So,
and for living in America, when we think of a governor, we think of somebody who's duly elected. These governors were mostly warlords who became governors by power or tribal affiliation or nepotism or something else, right?
I believe so. I'm speculating a little bit when I comment on that specific history. I would say this: the sultans were all slave traders. I mean, up until the 1960s, when slavery was finally outlawed in Arabia.
Right.
Yeah.
We know. I'd like to get into talking about Cobra Gold, some of your experiences with the Malaysian Special Forces and the Thais, and I would really like to hear your experiences with the Japanese Special Operations Unit, which I think very few people know anything at all about.
So the Japanese SOF, that's a heck of a cool story because that involved my ex-wife at the time. So in 2003, when I first got to First Group, they had just made the decision, which was quite controversial, to establish a SOF unit. And they, for reasons of historical...
that whole thing in Asia back in the 40s.
Yeah. So Article 9 of their constitution prohibits them from operating outside the territorial kind of waters and airspace of Japan. So what's a SOF unit supposed to really do? So they never had one. And a lot of people actually fell into the myth that they don't have that sort of cultural mindset or that capability. Completely wrong. So they did some amazing special operations in the Second World War. And this unit was established in spite of that. Again, it was pretty controversial, and so as a result, it was fairly secretive, and they were very careful with how they used it. Now, in 2003, when I first got to Group, a delegation, or maybe it was 03, a delegation from the Japanese SOF unit, which hadn't really been operationalized yet, came on this like big research tour. If you know anything about the Japanese, they research the shit out of everything they do before they do anything. And they're very careful about that. So they sent this delegation to all these special ops units and all the allies around the Pacific. So they came to first group, and then they went to Fort Bragg, and they went to the Australians, and they went to the Germans, and they did a bunch of stuff. Well, when they came to my unit, they needed an interpreter, or at least the group thought they needed an interpreter, and so they asked me because they knew my wife at the time was Japanese. So I was TDY somewhere, so I missed all this, but she was part of the whole delegation, and it was sort of unnecessary because all the officers spoke English, but they developed a relationship. And at a certain point, when they went back to Japan, they were sending RFIs to first group through my ex-wife. And so her unclassified Gmail account became the conduit for the Japanese SOF to research the whole .mil PF, doctrine, operations, training, whatever it is, manning, and the whole thing, the weaponry, all of that shit. And so she was passing these RFIs to first group on behalf of the Japanese SOF unit. And then years later, she paid an office call to their commander when she was on a visit to see her parents in Tokyo. And he was designing their what became their unit crest. And so when she walked into his office, he's kind of scratching his head, and he's got this drawing, and he's frustrated, and he's like having this trouble. And she's got a bit of a talent for decoration and art. And so she was like, you should put this here and put that there, and the sun and the sword here, and, the eagle. And he was like, that's brilliant. And so she designed the Japanese SOF crest that they use today.
That's cool.
So,
Yeah,
Lino, what was the political impetus for this that precipitated the creation of Japanese Special Forces in 2003? Because it was controversial and it's an island nation, not really allowed to have any sort of expeditionary warfare. I mean, what the hell was really going on there?
I mean, I should know more about answering this question, but I mean, I think, if I'm not mistaken at the time, you're looking at a North Korean nuclear capability. You've got a pretty highly conservative, by their definition, government in power in Tokyo at the time. And so there's an aspect of Japanese society that would like to have some independence from the post-World War II reality. Uh-huh. And so it was popular in this particular government to try to get some reinterpretation of their constitution, particularly Article 9, which presents that prohibition. And it's understandable in a way. I mean, they have some real security challenges,
right,
and they're almost entirely dependent on the United States,
right,
to meet that challenge. And the United States has not been a consistent ally from their perspective over the 60, 70 years that they've been in that role. And so, we were busy with the war on terror. George Bush was kind of encouraging the Japanese to do more in the Pacific. And then you had, North Korean nukes happening at the same time, conservative government. So it was a reinterpretation that was building towards Article 9 and what that actually meant. So they created...
And what was this unit's mission? I mean, ostensibly, what were they intended to do?
I mean, it's the full spectrum of special operations, and it wasn't really, from what I could tell, inhibited by the territorial borders of Japan. Mm-hmm. Maybe that's the story they told in order to justify it to the Diet or to the press. But as far as the unit guys were concerned, they had to be ready for anything.
Right.
And I mean, what kind of ops have these guys actually done over the years? Do you have any inkling of that?
I really don't. I mean, they train a lot with first group. They come to the States, and we go over there and we work with them. They're very cagey about their history. They don't want their lineage to be painted in the same brush that the Kempeitai and the other special ops units from the second director got painted with in World War II. That said, their unit coin has Bushido as our code written on it. It's kind of like, all right, well, how much space are you really trying to create here? And by the way, the coin. Is this a good time to go get another drink? Because I'm out.
Do you want to go get another drink?
If you want to get another drink,
go for it,
sure.
man.
And then
can I have 30 seconds?
You're gonna have 30 seconds, man.
For sure.
Guys, thank
right
you
back.
for joining us live. Apologize if the stream skipped a beat right there.
Yeah.
There it goes. So yeah, we're just giving Lino 2 seconds to go and grab a drink.
Yeah. Also, feel free to check out Lino's organization or the foundation that
The Combat Diver Foundation.
CombatDiver.org.
And Lino also has his own website that I'll tease out there real quick. I think it's a Lino Miani. Oh, I'm sorry. I'll have to put that in the description in a minute. So, guys,
Right, I'm back.
I will. We're working on getting the internet fixed so that we never ever have this problem again. And I apologize for the hiccups. It's really frustrating for me, believe me. So we're gonna go down to Spectrum tomorrow and try to square that away. So, Lino, thanks for coming back. Where do we want to pick it up with Cobra Gold?
Yeah, so the Japanese came down to Cobra Gold and they announced at the planning conference that they wanted to be an actual player team within the scenario. And that caused a lot of consternation with the Thais, who didn't want Japanese combat troops operating in a scenario on their territory. Mm-hmm. And so I was a battalion 3 at the time, but the group was busy with Sota P and a bunch of other stuff. So I ended up exercise. So I said, you guys sort it out. And what they ended up doing was allowing the Japanese to infiltrate and be there with us, but not in a player role.
And
so they were observers.
And was that from an intelligence perspective? I mean, are a lot of the Asian communities, do they feel that way about the Japanese military being involved in their operations? Is that a kind of leftover from World War II?
Yeah, it really is. And Thailand in particular, what a lot of people don't know, Thailand was the only country that was never been colonized in that part of the world. They were kind of taken over by the Japanese, but only they kind of opened the door and let them in because they didn't want to be taken over. Mm-hmm. So they sort of collaborated during World War II, but it wasn't really by choice. And there's a lot of sensitivities. It makes them unpopular. It would make them unpopular in the region if they were to allow Japanese combat troops to operate in that capacity, or at least.
If there are folks out there who are a little bit confused by like a pretty friendly advanced nation like Japan, why would anyone have an issue working with them? You got to go and read like a book like The Rape of Nanking, for instance, and what the Imperial Japanese military did in Manchuria and even in far-flung places like Indonesia, the Philippines. I mean, absolutely horrific shit. And there hasn't, unlike with Germany, there hasn't really been that strong reconciliation with their neighbors, I feel like. That a lot of that stuff kind of got, I don't want to say swept under the carpet, but it's like still an open wound in many ways that I feel like in Europe they've done a lot of work to try to resolve.
The interesting thing about a lot of the governments in Southeast Asia is they trace their roots to either the Japanese Imperial Army or the Special Ops Executive or the OSS that was working against them. And so a lot of most of the governments out there have founding fathers because the communists were the most organized right after the war. And so they fought the Japanese and the Japanese were gone and then they became a communist insurgency. So the connections with Japan and counter Japan in that part of the world are really, really fresh.
Yeah. Well, and I think part of it too is in the sense that, we didn't really put some of the same restrictions on Germany and Italy in terms of and they're landlocked with other countries, so there were those relations going on, and for them it's been a long time. It's been years and years, decades of working together, interacting. Where the Japanese, we kind of isolated, and they're isolated geographically, and so that familiarity and all that stuff hasn't had time to build. Where it's like, oh, they're just another country, and we put all that in the past. Those were different people. It's all still very fresh, and this is who they are.
Yeah, it really is very fresh in a way that it's hard for us to understand. And when the Japanese got rich, really before the rest of Asia did, a lot of their businessmen went out and just it wasn't. They were famous in the Philippines, for example, for just going down there and having girlfriends and having a good time. That doesn't give them the best kind of image everywhere that they go. So yeah, there's still a lot of that. And in any case, the Thais really weren't comfortable with allowing the Japanese to do that, so they were with us as observers and whatever. And it was at that time during that exercise, which everybody tried to keep the Japanese presence secret until the closing ceremony, when they put up a big billboard with the Japanese soft
oh shit
thing that my ex-wife designed. It was right there on the billboard, and it was like, oh well, I guess it's not secret anymore.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was interesting stuff. They jumped with us on a what was supposed to be a tactical infill, and the DZ was too freaking dangerous, and the company was like, I'm not jumping that at night. So the battalion staff was like, all right, we'll jump it during the day. So they jumped with us, and we had some fun on the drop zone, and it was neat.
There was something that you said about that exercise that really interested me, where you said the Thais treated previous U.S. training exercises as rewards, giving certain commanders an opportunity to conduct U.S.-funded training, increase their public profiles, and sometimes update their equipment. Over time, the goal of the Thai commanders was not to improve their capabilities, but simply to create a need for more training. This time was different. I think that's a very interesting observation about Special Forces missions, U.S. Special Forces missions, these FID missions, and where they succeed and where they really kind of fail. I was wondering if you could unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, so the feeling in 1st Special Forces Group over decades of working with the Thais is that they're just there to. We train them on raid, ambush, recon for 40 years, and they never seem to get better at it. And there's some truth to that, and when you can imagine if you're interacting with an ODA once every 3 years or once every 5 years, whatever skills you learned from the previous ODA have gone with personnel rotations or just time or whatever. And so it's a good chance for these units, which are not well funded, to get things from the United States, whether that's iPro or new equipment or techniques, or offer their best lieutenant the chance to go out and train with the Americans, and that makes him eligible for the next level of command, or who knows what that's all about. But it doesn't seem to have a lasting effect. Now, what had happened with our exercise in 2012 is the Army was reconciling with the new government of Thaksin Shinawat's party. His sister, whose name escapes me, but she's a Shinawat. You may remember Thaksin was a very popular populist leader from the north, a rich guy who promised to give basically handouts to the poor, and he won the election in Thailand, and he was overthrown in, I think, 2006 in a coup. Maybe it was 2008, I don't recall. Where the Army was in charge, and they sort of installed a more royalist government. The Army tends to be more aligned with the royalists. And so the royalists released, they met their promises to have an election or whatever, and so Shinawat's sister ended up running for his party, the Putai, I can't remember party, Putai party, which means I love Thai party, and she won, and she was legitimately elected in Thailand as far as anyone could tell. But the Army had been on the wrong side of that government for some time, because they were basically suppressing their supporters. And in fact, within the previous year, there was big protests in Bangkok in support of her being elected, et cetera, et cetera. And the Army was, well documented as beating these people down in the streets. Suddenly, their boss is now that lady that they were trying to prevent from winning the election. Mm-hmm. And so they kind of recognized, I think, that they better make amends, and they needed to do it in the part of Thailand where this exercise was taking place, which is the sort of home area for that party. So they were on a charm offensive. And what was different about our exercise is that, after 40 years of just trying to get new goggles and new equipment and some ammo so that they could shoot, suddenly they had their own internally generated mission, and that was to build rapport with the people that were voting for the Phú Thai party. Mm-hmm. And so they conceived of this exercise where we would go out into that countryside and we would have 20,000 plus villagers as part of this thing as quote unquote role players in the scenario. And when they briefed us on this, we were completely blown away. Like, we as Americans didn't know how to even fucking manage that, because we do exercise and all the role players are actors,
right?
They have their role. I'm supporting this side. Here's my story. This is how I feel, right, and I will play that role. Well, you can't do that with 20,000 Thai villagers. So what we told them, or what the Thais told them actually, was, you support Jack. Jack is your man. Whatever Jack tells you to do, like, you support. If he tells you to fight Dave's people, you go fight Dave's people. And they didn't care or know who the good guy was or who the bad guy was, like we do in our exercises. It wouldn't work. Mm-hmm. But the way the Thais had arranged it, they just knew that they were supporting Jack and Dave. And it was fascinating because, our guys were like, this is never going to work. And I said, wait a second. Hold on. There's no way we could make these guys play a role. These are Thai villagers, for fuck's sake. There's 20,000 of them.
Right.
And so we literally jumped teams into the Thai countryside, and they ended up in Thai villages. And all the Thai villagers knew was like, I like Jack, or I like Dave.
Hey man, it worked with the path at Lao and all them. So
yeah. And it was honestly, it was a really good way to run an exercise, but it was something the Americans were like, we were not comfortable with that at all. And so it was interesting. And it was also interesting that they were very comfortable using their Thai Buddhist temples as the center of the insurgency. Oh, wow. So we had ODAs. We had ODAs that were literally housed in Buddhist wats that were active. Like, worshipers would come and they'd be worshiping, and there's the ODA there trying to have security. And I remember a guy named Nick Umble, who was a team sergeant at the time, and he called me. He was angry as shit. And he was like, sir, how the fuck am I supposed to protect myself? I got all these like monks all over me and, people praying and stuff like that. I'm like, dude, that's what the Thai special forces are going to do, man.
Yeah.
You got to figure that shit out.
Pray well.
Yeah, it's not ideal, but that's how it works in Thailand, homie.
Yeah.
Man, it's such a wild experience. And you did end up in Iraq eventually, right? Like in 2006?
Yeah, it was right when I came back from Africa. So it was early 2006, and I went to Iraq. And by that point, came back from Africa, and they promoted me into an AS3 job. So I was like, great. I'd just been 6 months running around literally by myself on the African frontier, trying not to get shot or locked up. The next thing you know, I'm in like this fob. It sucked. I was like, God, man, it was a huge culture shock. And so I was just this planner guy, and planning operations and like stuck in this room with I had a TV and air conditioning and ice cream in the mess hall. And it was just bizarre. It was our FOB, like our company headquarters, our C team, the battalion headquarters was 230 people. And so, Jack, when I read your book, and you were talking about how the staffs at a certain point in the Iraq war were generating all this requirement, that was our reality. Mm-hmm. And I don't blame my commander per se, but when you have 230 people in the battalion staff, mm-hmm. there's a need for information. And we were literally receiving 30 to 40 pages of sit reps from the team every single night. Mm-hmm. And so what are you going to do if you're a captain on a team or a team sergeant trying to report that stuff? You're cutting and pasting. I mean, we couldn't read it.
Right.
Really? Cutting and pasting? No way.
Yeah, I mean, and it was like you'd get the same shit every day, and it was like, oh, this is cut and pasted from yesterday, and everybody would talk shit about the team, but it was like, holy cow, man, they're not going to spend 3 hours a night generating a new report. They didn't even go outside the wire last night.
Right.
You know, what are they going to report on? And at the time, we had this fascination with measures of effectiveness. There was that effects-based operations thing that came from the Air Force.
Yeah.
And all the SAMS guys are now switching off this show because I'm gonna tell you that was bullshit, man. The effects-based operations were designed by the Air Force to measure strategic bombing effects, which you can kind of do, right? You can count the number of bombs and the tonnage and the sorties and which factories got hit, and then downrange you can, downstream you can measure like how many widgets actually made it to the front after our bombing rage. You can't do that with counterinsurgency. Like, you can't measure what's in the mind of a man.
Right.
But that's what we were asking our guys to do.
There's that big push with atmospherics, and everything was about atmospherics. And it's like, motherfucker, I can gather atmospherics all day, but how does that defeat the insurgency? Like riddle me this. I'm going out there and I'm finding out how much oranges cost in the market, but that's not winning us the war. But there's this emphasis on it, and I really think it was because it was easy to do, and it wouldn't result in us getting attacked anymore because the enemy knows we're useless. And so it just becomes like an easy metric. Yeah.
And I felt bad for the teams because the teams are capable, and they know what's going on. And you go down and ask the E6 on, the junior Bravo on the team, he's going to know.
Right.
He'll tell you. And up at the battalion, and we didn't really quite have a clue. And so I was in charge of developing this system of measures of effectiveness and measures of performance. And there's some sort of distinction there, and we spent a week or 2 weeks on this with the commander nitpicking all this stuff. We came up with this huge chart, and I had this, and that's the CCIR, the PIR that you gave to the teams, so that we could learn something and we could make decisions ostensibly. So I had this captain from a National Guard. He was an infantry dude, National Guard mobilized guy who showed up, and he just had no personality. And anyway, we put him on the night shift, and his whole freaking job was to go through these 40, 50 pages of sit reps that he would print off every night and look for MOEs. Mm-hmm. And these MOEs, these measures of effectiveness, were literally things like how many children waved at the ODA when they entered the town,
right?
And I remember telling my commander, I'm like, sir, are they waving at us because they like us, or are they waving goodbye because they're about to blow our ass away?
Right.
And it didn't matter. It was just like how many children waved. And so, I had this, I'm not kidding, I had this captain, that's all he did for the entire rotation. Sitting in an empty room by himself on the night shift and try to pick these things up. And if he was lucky, we would get 6 or 8 of them a night from disparate ODAs, and it was completely useless. And I was like, how are we making decisions? Why don't we just go down there and ask the team sergeant or the captain, hey man, which villages are hot, man? Which ones don't like you? Where can you travel and where can you not travel?
Right.
And that'll tell us more than these,
the question is like, why are we making this harder on us than it needs to be? And it just needs, it needs like some fucking peer supervision. Somebody needs to come down and say, what are we doing here? What are we doing right now?
Yeah. Like, what's our end state? How do we know, how do we know when we've won? And how do we get to that point? And children waving is such a weird metric because sure, they're going to wave and follow your truck if you're throwing candy.
They want you to, they want the candy, they want the soccer balls.
Yeah.
Right.
Or the
maybe they're hungry, they just need an MRE, dude.
Or the first couple times they see you because you're a novelty, and then once you're not a novelty anymore, it's not like they're going to wave to every single person they see that they like, right? People don't do that. So yeah, It's sort of like a really good demonstration of how the command is separated from the actual operations on the ground. And they want to justify and want
Separated
charts
from
and
reality.
PowerPoints and these things to show this is how the war effort is going. But really, well, we've been here X number of years. That's how the war effort is going.
I sympathized with the commanders to a degree because there wasn't really a better alternative. I mean, the better alternative is ask the commanders and the sergeants on the ground, like, hey, man, what do you think? What's your assessment? But you can't justify that to higher. That's at a certain level that turns into, well, that just, what is this E6 know?
Right.
There's some guy on the NSC that's going to go, what, that came from Sergeant so-and-so? Why should I pay attention to that?
Right.
That's not the right answer, but that's what you're going to get.
Right. There's a certain amount of hubris at that level that they think they know more than the people on the ground.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Which,
I remember
sort of
them they came to us and their mentality was the ODAs need to get us the intel so we can win the war. And it's like, well, this war is not going to be won at some battalion level. No, it's going to be won at a squad level, if anything. So it's like the entire situation was inverted and flipped on itself.
Yeah, it was. I mean, like I said, I do have some sympathy for the commanders in a way, but at the same time, I mean, they have a responsibility to design a system that's going to work. And I don't really feel like we did that in Iraq, or we got to a point where we were so dependent on data that it just didn't make sense anymore. So it was kind of tough. And, I think where you're leading to ask me, though, Jack, is about that story that I wrote that hasn't been published about my sniper guys who took a shot at or thought about taking a shot at an IED in place.
Story. I thought it was interesting.
Well, I was bored in the FOB, and so I took a trip out to the wall where we had one responsibility for one tower along the MSR in just north of Baghdad, where we were in Taji. And I found two of my NCOs up there from my ODA. And I was like, hey guys, what are you doing? They're looking at something down the sights of the sniper system. And they're like, we're hunting rabbits. There's a guy acting funny over there on the other side of the mountain. What do we do? And so it was a very interesting sort of moral exercise of how do we deal with an obvious IED in place or right under our noses when we can't leave the wire. We have all these restrictions as far as dropping the hammer on a guy. And that was the war we were at in that specific part of Iraq at the time. It wasn't like that everywhere, and it changed depending on the fortunes of the war. But at the time, it was a huge drama to drop the hammer on anybody. And so we saw this guy digging a hole for an IED, and these two NCOs were having this debate about, do I shoot him or do I not shoot him? Do we send a warning shot? Do we, how do we deal with this? Do we roll out the wire and just roll him up and ask him? Because he's probably just some poor guy that's trying to make $20 digging a fucking hole, man. He doesn't know. Or maybe maybe he is a hardcore guy, but until we talk to him, how are we going to know that? And we can't drive out the wire because that requires, a con op signed by, a 20-star general and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
So we ended up, make a long story short, we ended up not, even shooting a warning shot at the guy and letting him do his business. And we just reported the information and watched him do his thing. Well, sure enough, somebody dropped an IED in that hole the next night, and it killed a robot the next day. Thankfully, no, humans were lost, but it snarled traffic, and it probably made us look pretty dumb and made the insurgents feel pretty good about, haha, we did this right under their fucking noses. But it was a really interesting discussion to have in that tower at that moment. Like, hey, what are our options here?
Lino, you probably already said this, but what year was this again?
It was 2006.
Yeah. I know that things for the military got very complicated. Even guys like on ODAs were saying that if they fired a shot on target, on a planned raid with CONOPS, if they fired a shot, there would be a full investigation in terms of why that shot was fired and if it was justified, which I think it makes it very challenging for soldiers to make those on the spot decisions when they need to. If they think that there's going to be, a lot of scrutiny and a lot of, Monday morning quarterbacking, a lot of people say, well, why didn't you shoot him in the leg or whatever else?
It's weird. It's like there was and there wasn't, though. Like, yeah, you had to fill out statements every time, but like, did anyone really look into it? It was almost like
it depended who you were also. So these guys were, if I remember correctly, they were an ODA that was assigned to do BDOC, base defense operations, for just our little compound within the compound. So, I mean, we were within this huge base, which was guarded by 4th ID. They were really the ones that had the responsibility to like go out and respond to things. We didn't even have that authority. And so there was all these questions about it. And it was like, and another, down in Ramadi at the same time, they were just shooting every military age male that had something in his hands.
Mm-hmm.
We were jealous of those dudes because it was easy. We were like, we know how to do
that
archery.
naval commando element up there in Ramadi? They were just shooting anybody, huh?
I didn't just say that.
Oh, maybe I was just making an inference.
No, I mean, look, the war was a lot hotter in Ramadi in 2006.
Dave, you got some viewer questions?
Yeah, we actually do have some questions. Let's see here.
We need to talk about USAID at some point because there's some interesting stories there.
All right,
sure,
we can get to that.
I don't know how much time we've got, but
yeah, we've been going for like 2 hours, but we can extend this a little bit longer.
Let's see here. First off, thank you, Andrew. He said he went to West Point. What are some of the good stories about West Point?
there are no good stories about West Point, man. There's just none. It's all gray. It sucks. You go to bed at 11, you don't meet any girls. You have terrible haircuts.
Yeah. And is that pretty much your day-to-day existence there?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's highly regimented, and without getting into the details of that, it's just every aspect of your life is controlled to the detail of how you fold your clothes and where you place your coffee maker in your room, if you're even allowed to have one. So some friends of mine used to say that West Point was the hardest school in the Army. I think in some ways that's probably true. I would say this: when you're 17 years old and you're going through the same thing as 1,000 other 17-year-olds, it's a bonding experience that lasts a lifetime. And so it was really fun in that respect. And so I think all of you can relate through things like basic training in AIT and the Q course or RIP or whatever, experience you've had with your peers. It has the same effect.
Right.
Yeah. So there was some fun. It was a lot of fun. I got to say, it was a good way to spend 4 years as a late teenager and an early 20-something. We did some good training, and I got some exposure to the Army, and I had some fun out at 10th Mountain Division one summer and learned how to be an infantryman. Shot a lot of weapons and got exposed to tanks and artillery and helicopters and the Army culture. So it was useful for that. I really enjoyed that.
How much does doing not a naval, but doing a military academy like West Point, a naval academy or something like that, or at least for West Point, how much does that play into your career past lieutenant, past captain, things like that? Is it important?
It's funny. I would say no, but a lot of my colleagues who were not West Pointers would say yes. They I'm reporting secondhand here. A lot of them would say, West Pointers have the advantage because everybody. Mm-hmm. Your entire cohort, a large percentage of the officer corps was together from the time they were 17 and, through their lieutenantship and their company commands and their battalion commands and so on. And that's valuable. So it's a networking tool that has some positive effect.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you're saying that ring knockers don't necessarily have an advantage. It's just the larger community. Or it's the community that they have and form.
I don't think that they have a specific advantage. Some guy who went to ROTC would probably tell me I'm crazy.
Okay. Fair enough.
Yeah.
Alejandro, thank you. Being a team that converted to dive, did you have to deal with any shenanigans like carrying a paddle or anchor everywhere before going to school?
Only in dive school. And there's probably a guy listening right now named Jamie Garza who was my echo on the ODA, and we went to dive school together. And yeah, we screwed up and we carried this big giant chain link around like for a couple of days. Jamie, sorry about that. It was my fault.
When you say we, do you mean you or do you mean Jamie or
no? It was
the royal.
It was I probably messed up. I don't even remember what it was, but it was this big chain link, like from an anchor cable on like an anchor chain on a battleship.
Yeah,
that had a rope and then with two loops on the end, and you had to put it around your neck and run everywhere together with that thing. Yeah, my fault, Jamie.
Thanks, Ian. Gold star, gentlemen. I was
strong, and you have that training background, and you can make it work. But everybody brings something to the table, and that can be quite different. And you'll find yourselves in weird situations where the guy you thought was pretty mundane suddenly shines because he had an experience as I don't know, a Christian missionary in Botswana or something, and he just has that ability. It was a neat place to be.
That's Ian, and then thanks again, Ian. We have all night if you want to talk. So Ian, I encourage you to keep rolling with the stories.
Okay. Glad he's enjoying it.
Thanks for the donation, BPAZ, and then and that's it. So
all right. So do you want to talk to us about then? You went off to NATO for a while, and I think maybe I'll save that for the bonus segment because there's some interesting stories about going to Norway and Korea. But you said you wanted to talk about USAID and some of the time you spent there.
Yeah, so I retired out of the NATO Special Operations headquarters in Belgium, and I hung out a shingle with Navisio Global, which is my company, and it was really just a way to mobilize my resume and my list of contacts to help people solve problems overseas, which is what I'm still doing now in Guatemala. But at a certain point, my ex-wife told me she wasn't comfortable with that level of risk, and she's like, "Dude, you got to get a real job." Mm-hmm. And for her, that meant a government job. So after a couple quite successful years in Belgium as a civilian, I got a job at USAID. And I was in the Office of Foreign Disaster Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, which was called OFDA. It no longer exists, but at least not by that name. And I was an advisor to the military for the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance. What people don't probably realize is that all those foreign disasters where you see the U.S. military, saving the day and all that, they're only there because OFDA invited them. So OFDA is the actual agency that has the authority to do those responses. When they feel they need the help of the specific capabilities of the military, they'll ask the Pentagon. And so I found myself on a very small team. It was like a battalion-sized agency. We bounced around the world, from the Middle East to the Far East to Latin America, and I got involved in disaster responses from the Caribbean islands to Peru to Guatemala to Kuwait to Iraq, Jordan, and Syria. And I worked with people in Korea, Japan, and elsewhere. So we constantly had our fingers on the pulse on a lot of different things. And during a response, it was a really cool way to work because most of the time we were in a pretty nice hotel. So life wasn't too hard. Mm-hmm. Occasionally there were guys that were living under the stars, but that was pretty rare. And then, in the morning I'd be with the Minister of Defense making an argument, or the ambassador. And in the afternoon, I'm kicking boxes out the back of an MH-53 somewhere, or a CH-53, whatever the Marines call those horrible, horrible aircraft that they fly around. So it was good work, but USAID is a mess, man. I've met some really great people in OFDA, and I still maintain great relationships with them, and all my bosses are real happy with me. But man, it was a tough place to work. They view themselves as humanitarians, and that does not mix well with the rest of the United States government.
So Why was it a mess? Like specifically when you say that, what do you mean?
Well, there's probably a lot of, layers to that onion. So OFTA has money from a lot of different laws and authorizations and agencies that kind of are parts of USAID that flow into that, to their operations. So that just right there creates a lot of issues. But they also have a culture of humanitarianism. So most of the people in that organization come from humanitarian backgrounds. And when I say that word humanitarian, what a lot of us military folks don't realize, that has a specific definition. Mm-hmm. And one of those aspects is we are neutral and we don't work with governments.
Right.
So now if you have that culture instilled in an entire agency of the United States government that's trying to, execute the foreign policy of that government, it gets really weird, man. We were grandstanding on a lot of points that, frankly, were. So it was tough environment to work in.
Hey, Lino, we lost you. I think we lost you on your side there. You said you were grandstanding on a number of points and we lost you. Can you repeat that part again?
That were frankly a little bit of they were inhibitive of U.S. foreign policy. Mm-hmm. Things like, well, we're not going to Syria was a good example. So the JSOTF wanted to support certain groups in order to get access to certain areas where they could then operate. And OFTA was like, no, we're not doing that because we're neutral and we don't support either side. And it was like, hey guys, we're U.S. government. We're not exactly, we'd like to be as humanitarian as possible, but we don't fit that definition.
Right.
If the United States government says we want to work with this group, maybe we need to work with that group.
Right. They a lot more approaching it as an NGO, but they're not an NGO.
Yeah.
Non-governmental organization.
And that's 100% accurate. That's exactly what the problem was.
Well, it's funny you say that because even like I know UNHCR, they get involved with. They're not nearly as nonpartisan as you might think from the outside looking in.
Yeah.
Right. But I think when you look at somebody like Doctors Without Borders, they are 100% completely non-governmental affiliated and aren't supporting a side. And their security people aren't even armed. Like they are reliant on goodwill for their protection.
No, and that's true. And actually there's a lot to be learned from that, frankly. And so I don't want to turn this into, OFTA is jacked up because they're not. There are some things that we as a group of military guys could learn from that.
Sure.
But there was also an insistence on doing it their way when sometimes it didn't work. And so I think the humanitarian community in general, globally, is starting to come to terms with the fact that sometimes their neutrality doesn't protect them from getting their heads lopped off.
Right.
They've learned that hard lesson in places like Syria and southern Sudan. And so they're starting now to at least agree that standards need to be developed for how do we incorporate armed security in order to allow us to do our job, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
The whole point of this is to say that OFTA was a tough place to work for a former military guy, frankly.
I bet.
Yeah, it really was. I mean, the work was fantastic. It was really great. It was difficult to adjust to the culture.
Sure. And I imagine that for anybody from the government or who has an American leaning saying, hey, we mess up, but we are a beacon of freedom and this and that, to go to an organization that is within the United States government, but also says, well, we don't care what the government thinks or we don't care about it, their foreign policy desires, anything else like that it would be challenging.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe the best way to illustrate this for the group here is that, when I was in Dominica, the lead civil military affairs coordinator on the team was a lady who had cut her teeth working to help people that were victims of the Burmese army.
Uh-huh.
And so for her, military guys in uniform were rapers and murderers.
Right.
I mean, that's what her formative years taught her. And so when we show up in Dominica and the civil affairs captain shows up in a meeting, she sees, threat, and she literally kicks this guy out of a meeting that was with the host nation and so and so. Now they had their own mission. Had I been that captain, I'd have been like, sorry, you can't kick me out of here. My colonel sent me down here to be in this meeting, and I'm going to be in this meeting. But, it just shows you kind of how strong culture can kind of inform the way people act on the ground. Mm-hmm. And it was tough for me. I did some cool stuff though. I mean, did a lot of great exercises in places like Guatemala and Brazil, Dominican Republic.
That one exercise where you ran a complete simulated volcano eruption in Guatemala, and it ended up being 5 weeks before an actual eruption in Guatemala. So you were obviously, the entire team was completely prepared for what actually happened in reality.
This is a story that doesn't get told enough. And so in 2018, the world probably remembers that there was a really violent volcanic eruption in Guatemala. What they didn't know is that for 2 years prior to that, we had rehearsed that exact scenario to the level of detail that 5 weeks prior, Lino Miani was directing helicopters to the exact LZ that was being used in the real emergency.
Wow.
I mean, these guys were putting tents in the exact spots that they had placed, temporary shelters in the exercise. They knew all the vehicles, all the routes, which vehicles weren't working, which weren't, who the volunteers were on the ground, they knew everything. They had it all dialed. It was on their speed dial because we had done it in the exercise. None of all that stuff was coincidence and frankly, really, really good luck. What didn't get told, and here's a fun story about this. So the public affairs people at the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance are really, they're really cagey. They're not really easy to work with. Bunch of former journalists. They don't actually know how to run a social, like a media shop. Okay. But they're really good at reporting stuff. So, I got a call. I was, because I had worked with all these people, they were sending me pictures directly from the disaster. I mean, like video and photos of like burnt bodies in the fucking houses in rural Guatemala. And I was posting it on my Twitter feed, and it went viral. Some of these tweets were getting 500,000 views, and so I started getting calls from international media asking me if they could use these images on their feeds, and I was like, look, man, these don't belong to me. Mm-hmm. But here's the person you need to talk to at the National Disaster Management Agency in Guatemala. Call them. And so I had the BBC called me, and they wanted to talk about, what did they want to talk about? The exercise, I think, that led up to this. And the PAO I directed them to the PAO at the embassy, and he directed them to the PAOs at OFTA. And the OFTA PAOs were like, I don't know anything about this. And they stonewalled the BBC. They were like, fuck you. We don't want to talk to you. We don't know anything about this. Well, they didn't bother calling me or anybody that had been there. Mm-hmm. And they just stonewalled this guy. So the BBC, needing to tell a story, went and found the opposition guy who was complaining about the response. And they interviewed him and put that story on the screen. And it made it seem like the response to the volcano was a complete shit show. And it wasn't.
Right.
It was exactly the opposite, in fact. But that's the story that got told. Next thing you know, there's literally protests in the street because the Guatemalan people believed that there was a giant shit show. That was not the case.
Right.
And so it was a really kind of sad commentary on the power of information, in this environment. But had they just asked me, I would have told them.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And so how long were you with USAID and that whole thing?
3 years. 3 years. Yeah, I did 3 years, and then it was time to move on. I was separated from my ex-wife by that point, and I met a wonderful lady in Guatemala who's with their disaster management agency, and now we have a daughter. So I'm here in Guatemala. And frankly, I moved down here after my daughter was born. Her name's Ginger. And I intended to be in Washington, D.C. for business purposes every quarter. And COVID, I made one trip, and before COVID happened, I literally left the States on January 20th, the day that it was discovered in the United States, and I haven't been back. And a lot of that has to do with Guatemala shut its borders. Mm-hmm. They weren't playing around. I mean, if you were out after 4 p.m., you ended up in the Hooskow with all the guys with 13 tattooed on their face and getting COVID. They were not playing around with COVID because they know they don't have the medical infrastructure to manage it.
Right.
And we still don't have a vaccine down here. So I literally went to the border with Mexico to get my visa renewed. And the lady there, it was shut. And it was only foot traffic. And she said, look, you can walk to Tapachula and Chiapas, but you can't come back.
Wow.
Yeah. So I said, okay, well, I guess I'm staying in Guatemala then.
Right.
And I just haven't had the occasion to go back. Now the airport's open and all that.
So, I mean, just to kind of like wrap up the story, I guess, I mean, you're kind of semi-stranded in Guatemala. I mean, thankfully you're with your family. But what are you up to nowadays?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So I'm back with my my consultancy. It's called Invisio Global. I established it when I was in Belgium. In fact, when I was still in uniform. I kind of put it on hold while I was with USAID, but I'm reestablishing it now. You know, and this kind of work is, again, I'm just mobilizing my contact list and my resume. And so it's, I'm working on a number of projects at any given time. Right now, I'm trying to establish an ISR company in Central America with an AFSOC officer. So, you know, ostensibly, once we raise enough money, we'll buy some planes and we will provide aerial overwatch for security companies in the region.
Okay.
It's something that no one else is doing. And it's using techniques that have been developed in other parts of the world that haven't yet taken hold in places like Guatemala or Honduras or El Salvador.
Right.
So we're doing that. I just got a call literally this afternoon from, to be careful what I say here, from a group of guys like us that have been called to help get a girl out of a country in the Caribbean. She got into a scrap with some folks, got shot, is in trouble. Government doesn't like her. How are we going to get her out? So I work on problems like that all the time. Mm-hmm. And so what I do with Invisio Global is I have a huge Rolodex. I've got a lot of capability and a lot of people with a lot of capability, and I just help folks solve problems. I don't sling guns. We don't do that. But we help people understand the situations that they encounter overseas. And so, yeah, that's what I'm doing. It's fun stuff.
Just out of curiosity, and sort of drawing a parallel for the people in the civilian community watching this, when you say you have a huge Rolodex and you have these people that you can call, how does this sort of translate to everyday life where people can leverage contacts? Like, are these contacts that you check in with once a year just to maintain that? Like, how can people leverage the contacts that they meet throughout their life in order to accomplish, maybe not getting a girl out of a situation like that, but just in achieving their goals or helping other people out or things like that?
Well, I tell you, social media it works, and it gets a bad rap. You know, Jack and I probably met each other on social media. I don't even fucking remember Jack.
Probably.
But yeah, I mean, it gets a bad rap. But look, LinkedIn and Twitter were paying my bills. Mm-hmm. And this is a way that I have met real, honest to goodness, good people that I've worked with, and quality people that I've worked with on serious projects I've met on social media. And it's a way to promote your expertise. It's a way to get your message out there. So you got to be careful what you do. You know, I've been burned many times. I kind of learned the hard way on some things, but I've learned some good lessons too. And I've had some clients and friends come from that environment. Yeah, I mean, I would encourage people to engage with it, and just always remember that you have to present yourself as a professional.
Right. Do you mind talking about some of the ways that you were burned, or a particular way that you were burned and what that means?
Yeah, I'll give you a recent example, actually. And I actually talked to Jack about this because I know he's been burned as well. I said something. Yeah, I said something critical. What was perceived as critical of other SF guys on Twitter, I think it was, and an anonymous account, started whining to me about, hey, you shouldn't be critical of your brothers, and the family's going to judge you, and all this other crap. Turns out, he's actually a very influential guy within the former Special Forces community. And he said about to slander me on, through his channels, and I've actually received feedback on that in other ways later down the road.
Yeah.
And so you don't want that. I try to be as positive as I can about people.
Right.
But there's some lines that we're all A-type guys here, man. Some shit sets you off, and you'll say something back, and that's that. But
yeah.
So that's kind of how I've been burnt.
Lino, plug your book that I read and I found very helpful when I was over in the Philippines working over there. You wrote a book about the Sulu arms market.
Mm-hmm. So I am probably one of only 3 people that have written about the illicit arms market in that part of the world. I wrote about specifically the Philippines, Indonesia, and Malaysia. It's called the Sulu arms market. I did it while I was a grad student in Malaysia. And so as a result, at the time I was on a special program called the Olmsted Foundation Scholarship, which for those of you who don't know, it's a private foundation made by a guy named George Olmsted, who donated his private fortune to send military officers to study overseas so that they could learn something about cultures that are not their own. His idea was that made them better leaders. And so I chose Malaysia because I thought it was a place that could challenge me. I had worked with the Malaysian Army and police, but that it was also a nice place that I could enjoy. And so I found it to be really fascinating. While I was there, I wrote about the illicit arms trade in that region. It was nominated for an award in 2011. Didn't win, but it was longlisted. And, it's about how people smuggle guns in the Philippines primarily, but also Indonesia and Malaysia. It's a really interesting problem. There's historical ties, tribal dynamics. I mean, government intrigue, Al-Qaeda comes into play. It's a China, meth, you name it. I mean, the North Koreans sent a sub full of guns. It's all kinds of stuff.
I will say that it's currently unavailable on Amazon. We should get that on Kindle.
You have to go to the publisher's website.
To the actual publisher?
Yeah, it's published by the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore. So if you go to the ICS website, or ICS bookshop, you'll find it there.
Okay.
It's currently on sale, so get it while it's hot.
Yeah, no, it was a good book. And like I said, I found it very helpful in my own research when I was down in that part of the world, trying to understand some of the dynamics going on. So Lino, thank you so much, man, for joining us tonight. Hit us up again about the Combat Divers Foundation and the event you have going on, and then you have your own website also.
Yep. So combatdiver.org is where you can find all the information about the deep dive and any events we've got going on. We're about to unveil a virtual museum, which is so freaking cool. I'm so excited to talk about it. It's like the space station underwater where you have all this combat diver history, and it's really neat. And then my company is called Navisio Global. That's Navisio, Navisio Global. So for those of you who have business ideas or problems you need solved around the world, and you don't know how to solve them, call me. If I can't do it myself, believe me, I know somebody that can.
So I'll ask you to stick around for a moment for the bonus segment, if you can. And next week, I hope you'll join us next Friday. Baz Basil, retired CIA paramilitary officer. He's going to be on the show. Spent time in, well, I'll let him describe where he was at and what he was doing.
Sure.
Very interesting guy, old school guy.
And we do apologize for the internet issues that we've encountered.
This should be the last time.
We found a fix. It's going to be fixed. This is the last time I'll say anything about it, but check out Battle Line Podcast from a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah.
They interviewed me. It's just a brief overview of my life. Well, thank you very much. We appreciate it, man.
I enjoyed it, man. I mean, when you're retired, you just want to talk about your old stories, right? So
Yeah.
with guys that know what you're talking about.
And the story, I mean, your stories are fantastic. And I know we barely kind of scratched the surface of,
Yeah, there's a bunch more.
yeah. And we'd love to have you on again sometime and, and talk about a bunch more of those and get an update.
We'll hit that.
Sure, man.
Yeah.
Well, let me do this. I know we're going into a bonus segment.
Uh-huh.
I need to take a break.
All right.
Yep. We're going to